welcome everyone who's watching us live. So this platform, the Future Leadership platform, it was started during lockdown. So essentially it's a COVID baby. And we are a community of change makers, and we are all being the change that we want to see in the world, each one of us. And before I start, I would like to share a very inspiring quote that one of our team members shared, Lahar Mehta. It's a quote by Margaret Wheatley, and she says that there is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Despite current ads and slogans, the world doesn't change one person at a time. It changes when networks of relationships form among people, such as this one, who share a common cause and a vision of what's possible. So that's the reason we are all here together today. So we have an amazing panel here, and two of them are all the way from Australia. And we have with us Nicole Gibson. She's an Australian influencer and a social pioneer. She's a multi-award-winning millennial entrepreneur. She's also a former mental health commissioner of Australia and the youngest. And she's a speaker and a transformational facilitator. And she's a fierce ambassador of mental health. And she started an organization called En Rouge when she was 19. And she likes to see herself as an unstoppable messenger of love and human potential. Yes. And she published a book in April 2020 this year. It's called Love Out Loud, and which is a millennial's guide to enlightenment. And she says after working with more than 300,000 individuals across the world, people from diverse range of countries, cultures, contexts, she discovered something extremely profound. And she says that there is absolutely more of what makes us common than what separates us. So we have more in common than what separates us. And we have with us also Igor Kramen. He's based in Australia as well, and he's the founder of the Human Connection Movement. It is a global movement which dissolves barriers between people, not boundaries, and it connects people worldwide. And his movement connects people worldwide, and he's passionate about amplifying cohesion and interconnections with groups. He assists students, organizations, leadership teams to become better communicators. And he also works with people who struggle with loneliness and social isolation. So he also has a background in film and theater, and he bridges connection between people through eye gazing, and a session that we just had as well among our panel a few minutes ago. We also have with us Simone Poppleton. She's based in South Africa, and she's been in our panel a few times before. So many of us who's watching her have seen her before, and she is also a kind of our in-house expert on love and relationships. And she's a relationship counselor and coach, and she has a practice called Rooted in Love. And we also have Julie, who's also been here and is a communication coach. She also wrote a book on love, prose mostly. And she had worked in the private sector for many years as an environmental scientist. And she's building a practice as well on love and business. So let's get started. So I keep hearing from a lot of people about, especially people say, you know, if it's true, especially when I intend to have a session like this, calling it boundaries, love and boundaries, and people say, oh, if it's true love, then we don't need boundaries. I'd like to hear from you, what are boundaries and why do we need them, and whether it's in love, business, or any kind of relationships. So,
if you're going to love wholeheartedly, you have to be whole, and you can't be a whole if you don't have boundaries. And I think people have a misconception of boundaries as walls, as barriers. They are containers. And I was thinking about this before we started, and the image that came to my mind, or the analogy that came to my mind, was if we imagine people as lakes full of water, and those lakes can move. And the common misconception is that those two lakes have to merge into one. Mm-hmm. The best way that I can talk about it is imagine an empty lake, two empty lakes trying to merge. You have two lakes of emptiness. You can only share what overflows from you. And in order to overflow, you can't share what you don't have. So in order to have something, including love, you have to have that container. You have to know who you are before you can possibly have space to know another. That's my starter.
Yeah, I agree with you, Julie. And I think, yeah, it does polarize people, like boundaries. And just to kind of reiterate what you were saying, Radhika, that, you know, why do you need boundaries if you're in love? Like, why do you need to set rules? And I think that it's not about constricting or limiting what's possible, although it may be perceived to be that way when you use the word. But I think for me, boundaries is more about respect. It's understanding that we know within ourselves what's important to us. And when we communicate that authentically, openly, and vulnerably, then we're creating more space for more cohesion and connection to occur, as opposed to not saying what we're feeling and experiencing. So when we're communicating, the more equal and balanced the exchange is between people, the more, as Julie was saying, the lakes are able to merge together as one and experience that unification and sense of understanding that only comes from a place of shared awareness. I think it's important to be able to say, even in like, let's ground this right now and go, what's a specific example? And say, well, let's say you started seeing or dating someone or spending time with someone for a couple of months, and you've been seeing them 4 or 5 times a week, and you realize that a lot of your energy is going towards them because they excite you, and that's beautiful. But in order for it to be sustainable long term, for there to be longevity, there needs to be a sense of setting a boundary there, perhaps, and saying, okay, how much time do I need for myself to ensure that I can continue growing my creativity in my own internal project that I'm manifesting, or whatever it is, to ensure that I can still show up for my beloved. Because if we're not nurturing our inner self, then when we show up with our partner, we're not completely there. So I think that's where it's important to use the word boundaries and go into that in that fashion. That's my kind of taste on that for now.
I think for me, and just my understanding of it, and I think Igor and Julie have already really got to the core of it, that there is this need for us to almost upgrade our language of boundaries, because I think we very typically understand it as something that limits, a barrier, constricts, takes away, sets conditions for. But I think that actually it allows for abundance rather than deficit. It's when there are boundaries, how much more compassionately, generously, openly can I show up because I have these boundaries in place. So rather than using language of deficits or what it takes away, I think it's wonderful that we're speaking about it as, what does it offer us? What can we do? And just the very basic understanding or definition of boundaries is, what am I okay with and what am I not okay with? What am I willing to accept and what am I not willing to accept? And there was this really beautiful quote that I just wanted to share, and it says, boundaries are the distance at which I can love me and you simultaneously. And I think that's really what Julie was speaking about in terms of the lake, that actually it's the greatest form of love. So instead of seeing it as taking away from love, or if I love, I can't, there won't be boundaries. Actually, it enables me to love you and me at the same time. And Brene Brown obviously talks a lot about boundaries, and there's some beautiful quotes that have been shared about her that I really enjoyed and appreciated. And she says something that I thought was really powerful, is that we almost ask ourselves, what boundaries do I need to put in place in order to have that feeling of integrity, so that I can make the most generous assumptions about the other? So how can I show up in this relationship or this space, workspace even, with boundaries in place, so that it's from a place of integrity, so that I can think the best of you? And I think that that's such a lovely way to actually understand boundaries from more of a language of abundance than deficit.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I think when it comes to boundaries, one of the most powerful reframes that I've sort of position boundaries in my thinking has been really looking at it through the lens of trust and understanding that we actually can't develop trust without boundaries. When you think about the process of what creates trust, trust is not developed immediately, and it's definitely not developed in a single choice or action. It's developed over time, and that's also how security is built within a relationship. So when you think about placing a boundary down, it's in that space that someone else, it becomes clear whether or not someone else has the capacity, the ability, the awareness to be able to respect that boundary. And in the process of repeatedly respecting that boundary, you develop trust for that other person. You can develop trust in the relationship. I've also found that in facilitation, the more people, I think boundaries and needs are very closely interconnected, if not mutually exclusive. When one person is comfortable and confident in vocalizing what their needs are, it does create a sense of safety for others. And I think so often we have a fear around voicing our needs, mostly due to not necessarily feeling worthy of having those needs met, or fearing that someone else that we care about is going to reject us or judge what those boundaries are. But it actually has the opposite effect. When you are confident and comfortable in stating that boundary, it gives others permission to do the same. And within that space, more trust is developed, which then leads itself to more intimacy. So often I think, as you were just speaking to Simone, the negative viewpoint on boundaries is sort of obsolete when you really start to understand their nature, because it's really the only way to develop intimacy in a relationship.
Nicole, you just said something that really prompted a major insight on my side. If we don't understand our own boundaries, we don't know what is ours and what is just a projection from someone else. And therefore, lack of boundaries actually destroys trust. Because if you can't trust, if we know that was, that comment, it's not mine, it's because of that person and that person's stuff. If we're not aware of that, and that awareness requires that container, then it actively, just trying to think, does it actively undermine trust, or is it simply that there will be this constant attempt to build trust by all this sharing, but you're sharing, but you don't know if it's yours or the other person's. And so I think it just leads to a really toxic mess. Sorry, it's a very inarticulate way of saying that was a great insight, which I've now not shared very well. But that was,
Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. I feel that, that the ability to be able to communicate boundaries and needs really does come down to being secure in who you are. And, inevitably, the more secure in who you are, the more other people are going to be able to trust in you, because you're demonstrating that trust. And again, I think this is the power of boundaries. We're constantly teaching others how to treat us. We're constantly demonstrating our worth. We're constantly demonstrating our standards in how others are going to engage and interact. And in the absence of not being able to communicate clearly, actually it creates a massive feeling of unsafety for those around us, because they're not actually knowing how to interact with us. And this is when I think, which is what you're speaking to, Julie, projection starts to seep into relationships when those boundaries are unknown or unstipulated.
I had just a quick thought. I had a really interesting conversation with a teacher of mine. And I told her about this live call, and she said, you communicate your boundaries energetically. You don't even need to say what they are. If you know what your boundaries are, people will be able to read it in your field. They'll be able to sense it in you. So they'll know how far to kind of go with certain things, and certain things they can say, and certain things they think they can get away with, and certain things they don't think they can get away with. So I think that's an interesting place to kind of explore as well, because there's some people you just know you won't be able to get away with communicating a specific thing.
Yeah.
You know inherently what it is that you're embodying and what you're experiencing, what you will and won't allow. I think that also translates without you actually having to talk about it.
But there are people who don't often get the cues, right? So in that sense, we need to communicate, and a lot of people are fearful of communicating what they want, right? because they fear that they would disappoint the other people. And I do know a lot of people who don't communicate what they want because they fear that they're going to upset us, but actually they make things even more difficult actually by not communicating. How do we communicate, like, in a very non-invasive manner, right?
But Radhika, I just want to, something that I'm working with quite a lot in sort of re-energizing what I'm doing, is to draw the difference between communication and verbalization. Because as Igor said, we are communicating energetically all the time. Some people are tuned in, some people aren't. But the importance of verbalizing is so, I don't want to sound cliched, it's so key. And the way I've worked for a long time is the way of doing that gently is to start all of your sentences with I.
With I.
Not you. So it's not you make me feel angry. It's I feel angry when you do that or something. And immediately you're owning your stuff, your feelings. That's one way of doing it, but to do that you actually have to know what's okay and not okay with yourself.
I think something that you're speaking about, Judy, that Igor also touched on, and obviously he really specialized in that, so I'm sure he'll have great insight, is around that connection with our mind, body, and soul, and how our body is speaking all the time. And we're not just communicating our boundaries with our words, as you were saying, Judy, but with our bodies, with our eyes, with our hands, our arms, our facial expressions. And so before we can get to the words, we really need to tune into our bodies of where does this sit in me, because our body speaks to us almost as the first alert. It is telling us something all the time before our thoughts and our words have caught up with what our body is saying. And so actually it's a great tool for us to really tune into our bodies. Very much that exercise of taking a deep breath. Where does that sit? Where is my center? And really speaking with your boundaries from that center space. Because I think that when we're able to say in an exchange, something makes me feel uncomfortable, and really honoring that discomfort or resentment, even possibly irritation that you're feeling, is when you're able to say there's been a boundary crossed. And then you're able to speak from that space of I'm feeling something, and it means I need to honor that feeling in me, so that it becomes less about the other and actually really just an opportunity to honor what's happening inside the body. And I think we're often fearful of emotions like irritation, even anger. And I've been very interested by the relationship between anger and boundaries, because actually that's quite a good indicator that something's been crossed when I start to feel that irritability, resentment, angry feelings inside. And it's probably because I'm feeling there is an expectation being placed on me. I'm feeling guilty. I'm feeling that I'm going to let somebody down. And so everybody becomes the yes person. But actually inside you're saying, I want to say no. And when we're not honoring that, it makes us feel that anger inside. And actually the outburst is not a healthy or constructive way to deal with setting boundaries, but it should be a sign that we're trying to protect something within ourselves and we need to restore something. So when people almost do an exercise of mindfully tuning in to past experiences and saying, what made me feel uncomfortable about that interaction at work or in my relationship, and getting to that feeling of it made me feel like I was being pushed, or it made me feel as if I was being selfish for saying no, then you're able to really speak from that space and honor it and say, I'm going to protect this, but I'm also going to restore that wholeness that we've been talking about. And that's not just an honoring of what I want then, but an honoring of what I need, which is what Nicole was saying that I found so important. Boundaries and needs go hand in hand. When we express boundaries, we're actually making a request for our needs to be met. So when we say, I feel, whatever that emotion is, the feeling word, we should then say, because what I'm needing is. And it's a beautiful opportunity to actually ask for what we need in that exchange, because people are not mind readers. They're not supposed to know or automatically what we need or what that boundary looks like. And we are equipped with the ability to be able to tell them.
We've been talking very much about, I think, intimate, loving relationships, but the need of expressing this in, be it the workplace or a community space, some of the worst sort of boundary transgressions I've seen in my career is with people who are there to serve a need in a community, who feel that they have to be available 24/7 because there is such a deep need in a community space for something. So even at work, and of course there's all sorts of perceived threats or real threats to job security and that kind of thing. So this practice of verbalizing boundary and that need. And Simone, thanks for that about the I feel X and therefore I need Y, is a little light bulb moment for me on that follow up to I feel. And we've got to be able to do the same in the workplace. Expressing feelings in the workplace is often perceived as weak. Its needs are often demanded, not requested. They are not expressed as needs, but as orders. So there's a lot of languaging and practice that is needed in our workspaces, wherever those workspaces are, on this boundary management as well, especially now that we are online so much.
Someone, Sanchita, had asked, how do we instill values and kindness and deep empathy with your loved ones?
I think the first thing there is to really know what they are for you. And no, it's a question that a lot of people ask me in my work, is a question in a similar vein. How do I find people with aligned values? How do I maintain my values? And I feel like this all comes down to clarity. The clearer you around what this means for you, and really like fleshing out not just a general value like say adventure or health, but really taking the time to write out and give due consideration to what that truly means for you. What does it mean for you to be healthy? What does it mean for you to be adventurous? What does it look like in action? What are the actions that you would demonstrate those values? And the clearer you are in the lived embodiment of those values and what it means to be kind, we all have different interpretations of what that looks like. In fact, I would say that most people, from my experience, are all doing what they see to be the right thing in a moment. And when you start to recognize that, it's a very interesting thing to awaken to, that when we judge someone as, coming across as arrogant, they're very well justified in how they're being in that frame of reality. So it's personal clarity. And I think this feeds into the conversation that we were having just before, some of you sharing. When there's a need in a community, for instance, does the person on the front line, are they able to draw the boundaries they need to be able to fill their own cup up? Again, it's the clarity to understand where you're coming from, what's driving the overgiving, because there's an imbalance in you. And inevitably, when you're not clear on yourself and your own energy, it's going to have an opposite effect. When you give, it will create more imbalance because you're giving from a place of imbalance. And you're placing, an expectation that someone's meeting your value when you don't actually have clarity around what that means. At the end of the day, we've got to take personal responsibility and understand that we are the ones that are choosing to be in proximity to the people and situations that we're choosing to be in proximity to. And if that's out of alignment to us, then we're ultimately responsible for that.
And I've seen the question was posed by, she's a mother, and I've seen with a lot of mothers, they keep giving. They often give from a point of imbalance, as Nicole was saying. So they need to reach a point of like clarity, right? If you want to know, I feel X and therefore I need that. So right? And if you could elaborate a bit.
I think it's really important in this conversation to actually break down identity and the attachments to identity. And it's very important for a human being to have a sense of placement in the world and to have a sense of belonging. And often we won't break up with identities that are actually very toxic for us because we're afraid that we don't know who we'll become, so we stick to identities to feel safe, to feel like a sense of okayness in how other people relate to us. The nature of identity is fluid, we can choose.
Yeah, so identified with the role, right? Yeah.
And there's lots of, and Simone, you'd be better placed to answer this than me, but I mean, there's lots of different ways of describing identity. We've got role identities, we've got in-group identities, we've got all sorts of things. And there is this lovely it's a lovely term, a center of narrative gravity. I love that, where these things overlap, and identifying with that. But I just wanted to say something about that identification of mother as giver, because again, the language is so important, and we talk about it all the time. And a reframe that I like to use in my head is mother as nurturer. And I promise I'm not equating children to plants, okay? But if you think of the word nurture, if you nurture vegetables, you water them and you walk away and they grow by themselves. And I really encourage any caregiver, nurturer, be it a mother, or if you're a nurse, or, you know, nursing is a bit different, obviously, in critical situations, but particularly mothering. You can't give from a place of emptiness, and you do damage when you do. If mothers can start to think of themselves as nurturers and growers, that might give them some permissions in themselves to take care of themselves, because they've got to nurture themselves as well.
I think there is this strong sense that we replicate patterns that serve us in some way, and that's what Nicole was talking about, that I think is so important to honor and acknowledge, that these patterns are not always healthy for us, but because they're so familiar, such as the people-pleasing behavior or pattern, or the giver, that it's so ingrained, socialized within us, you know, yes, partly as women, but perhaps just in general as people, to always be agreeable. And part of what's difficult about boundaries is that sometimes the other is not going to be in agreement with you, and being able to give yourself permission anyway, because it gives them permission to ask for the same, to have their need honored. But I think that we continue to perpetuate these patterns of behavior, such as no boundaries, because it serves us in some way. And sometimes it serves us from not having to face the reality of what it looks like when that's not there, you know, and that's actually looking ourselves in the mirror and saying, what do I see? And so it feels easier to just stay with what we know rather than to change the behavior or the pattern. And so my encouragement for people who do struggle with boundaries is really to start small. I think that there are big boundaries that we're talking about, really, verbalizing, for example, is a big boundary, because you're really putting yourself out there on the line, essentially, with the recognition that the other might not agree. But start in small ways, in ways that you can, and incrementally you can increase the amount of boundaries that you put in until it's a skill set. Boundaries are not something we're born with. It's something we learn, we grow in, we stretch the muscle for boundaries. And so I think it's so important for us to start with the things we can. So as moms, you might not be able to impose huge boundaries right now at particular ages, depending on your children's age. But there are boundaries you can enforce and ask for what you need. And sometimes it starts with just saying it in your head and actually saying, at least I know what the boundary is. Can I ask for that right now? Maybe it's not possible. Maybe I'm not courageous enough, but do I at least know it? And that's already courageous and compassionate. And then you take the next step by asking. So I think those small steps actually amount to great leaps in the learning of boundaries.
I think it's also nice to reverse engineer this whole conversation. Go, what are the implications of me not saying what my boundaries are? How am I going to continuously feel? What type of experiences am I going to continuously recreate? What type of people am I going to continuously re-manifest into my life to learn these lessons? How much energy do I have to deal with this? Because then you go, wait a second, I don't really want to not speak up and honor my truth and what I'm experiencing, because it's not actually enabling me to step into who I truly am and my most authentic version of who I am. And you can, how long is a piece of string? You can take as long as you want to get there, but it's just you can make the choice today and say, I choose to no longer recreate experiences which are not in alignment with the highest good of my highest evolution. And when it comes to my relationships, and what does that look like? What does that feel like? What do you need to be feeling in your body to be able to have a sense of certainty and resolve and sovereignty? What would it look like? Paint that picture for yourself, because sometimes we don't know what it feels like until we've experienced it. And so start experiencing it before it's actually happened, and then your body will adjust. So Joe Dispenza talks a lot about that. because I think he says something like the body doesn't know the difference between what you're actually experiencing and the combination between your thoughts and your emotions. So if you create a cocktail of energy within you that imposes and supposes that something already exists within you, then you're creating a frequency that then magnetizes that very same alignment within the quantum field. I'm a big fan of not fake it till you make it, but be it, and then and you'll build inside of you.
Or kind of feel it.
Yeah, feel it, exactly.
Yeah, or grow into that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of what about this taking responsibility, right, for who you are, I think that's where it begins. It's like when you create boundaries. So suppose you create a boundary around your house or your garden. And I think people should take that responsibility for that particular. But most often, I think people don't take that responsibility, right? If they are facing something very negative, they would not look within, but rather they would even go to the extent of blaming themselves or feeling guilty for what happened. So there's this question that we had from a viewer is, so it says, when two people have well-defined and flexible boundaries between them, every time one crosses some boundary set by the other, will they not be going further and further apart? I think we already spoke about it, right, Simone? Instead of getting closer and closer, as true love demands. So we may reach a point, and may a point not come when things simply become too intolerable between them and they eventually have to break up.
I find it interesting the use of the language true love demands.
True love demands. Must be from a song or something.
Perhaps there's a little bit of a reframe that's needed in understanding the nature of love. Love creates and spaciousness and freedom. And I suppose when you've never experienced that, it can be difficult to distinguish these lines. So perhaps understanding that if you're feeling constricted in any way, perhaps you haven't yet experienced what it feels like to really be in the presence of true love, and to have that be enough of an insight to be able to navigate a relational dynamic like that. I had a friend say to me once, which is a very powerful and simple sentence, which was, if there's any doubt, there's no doubt, which is essentially saying, if you have any doubt at all, then it's probably
if you question it. Yeah,
we've got to be so careful. We don't know what we don't know. I mean, if I think back 30 years to my 20s, I thought I was taking responsibility. I thought I was just fine. I didn't know what I didn't know. So, and also the story that seems to prevail, about love and what it is just a story, and it is a popularized story. We've all bought into it at one level or one stage of our lives because it's taken as given. And I think we each have to define for ourselves what it means, and that to re-story what a boundary is as well. I think, just to answer that particular question, if you are constantly transgressing boundaries, building yourself is a lifelong, your sense of self, I think, is a lifelong experience. And the way we do it is this constant negotiation of boundaries with new people, with new experiences, with new situations. And so not to see it as a destination, but just an ongoing experience. New person, something new happens. Did that tweak me? Didn't it? Learn something new about myself, my sense of self solidifies more, or whatever. So just, I think a word of hopefully reassurance that this is not a nirvana destination. It is, and that's why I believe in true love. It's that lovely balance between what you said, Nicole, about respect and trust. And you will learn where a person stands on something. But if you're both growing, you're going to learn new somethings, and you'll test those boundaries with each other, learn them, respect them. And the deeper that trust and love becomes, the more okay you become with testing those boundaries. Yeah.
I think that what Judy's speaking about that's really important is around that sense of it's not a destination, which means that I need to let go of almost the expectation of that the boundary will always be honored. And I think that I hope that this comes across the right way, is that we have boundaries, but we cannot always expect that others are going to respect that boundary, because some people won't. So then we need to understand that if it is crossed, what am I going to do about it? And it's almost normalizing that there will come times when people are going to cross our boundaries, and how am I going to receive that crossing of the boundary? Am I going to accept it, or am I not? And rather than the expectation that others will always respect our boundaries, because as we know from personal experience, that's not the case. Because boundaries in themselves, especially, kind of in all relationships actually, are more subjective. So what I'm okay with is not necessarily what the other's okay with. And if we haven't clarified that in our relationship, then it leaves this gray area. So it is important, of course, that we try clarify that, but there will be times in which those boundaries are crossed. And then if I'm not willing to accept that, if I think about the question that was asked, firstly, why is there this continuous crossing of boundaries? Why is that okay? And secondly, why are you okay that it happens again and again and again, and you're not changing that pattern? Well, you're kind of not saying, I'm not okay with this. I'm not going to accept that you keep crossing my boundary, or I'm not going to accept that I feel inclined to keep crossing yours. What is this dance we've created as a couple, and how do I change it or get out of it? But to stay the same in it is not healthy, and it doesn't serve me or you in a healthy way.
And I feel like as humans, like fundamentally, every single person on this earth wants to be seen, heard, valued, and understood. We want to experience love, and everything that holds us from that is a barrier that we've created. It is something that we've stretched outside of ourselves. It's a shield that has stopped us from being seen. But if we allow ourselves to be seen, if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, if we allow ourselves to be courageous enough to be able to sit in the uncertainty and allow for whomever it is in our lives, whether it be our partners or our friends or our families, anyone that's triggering us, if we allow ourselves to be in that situation where we're embodying whatever it is that's arising in each moment, there's this sense of purity that emerges where you're beginning to align to the truth of the situation. And you don't need to try to create boundaries anymore, because you're allowing yourself to be seen. And as a result, that then creates the space for the other person to take their shield off and be seen. So a lot of my work is based on nonverbal communication, and we create boundaries energetically before we even begin talking. So we don't need to discuss the situation. We have a visceral experience of it before the exercises even begin with our method. And everything is, like, as Nicole said, it's based on trust. Like, if we don't have an equal exchange of giving and receiving and trust, then people aren't going to open up and be vulnerable. They're not going to enter a space of vulnerability because they don't trust you. So I feel that if we look into each other's eyes and hold an elongated gaze just for a little bit longer, and we move beyond the masks and the characters that we try to create to try to fit into this world, to fit in with the status quo, and we're trying to clearly break that, right, Radhika? So breaking the status quo it starts from within. It's a really uncomfortable process. It's quite scary, and everything you identify with in your life, it challenges you to really kind of go, who am I? And, Nicole was talking about identity, and I'm just going to go back to that and just say, that's the core of everything. We need to let go of who we think we are. This is literally something Nicole said in a podcast where I recorded what she said, and it's coming to me now. And she said, we have to let go of who we think we are so we can step into who we truly are. And I think that just happens from letting go and allowing for whatever comes up to move through.
There's a question from Alex. He's asking, is it possible to give an example of how to vocalize our boundaries with the hope to reach a point of equilibrium with the person we're connecting with?
Can he define equilibrium?
I think she means like equal
In
exchange,
balance, I
basically.
think. Yeah, equal exchange. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would.
Because this is an interesting, thing to discuss here, because equal exchange is very different to compromise. I feel one of the pieces of clarity that boundaries and needs provide is an understanding of alignment, what is aligned and what is not aligned. And people often fall into the pattern of when something's not aligned, but they're not willing to let go because of their attachment to it, they begin projecting that disappointment in self and anger at self and resentment of self onto the other person in hopes that they will change and transform to force the alignment. I think a good analogy is trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. It's just not going to work. Whereas if you can start to understand that life and reality is a feedback loop, and if you're meeting resistance because there are people that are not able, what reality is showing you is essentially what is not the path. And that is your invitation to redirect yourself back into a state of alignment, flow, ease, grace, so on. And in that space, when you're fully, truly met, then there will be an equal exchange with all that is, not just in relationship with another person, but all that is life. Because ultimately, this reality that we're living in is perfectly and harmoniously synchronized. It's just our perception that gets in the way. The universe loves us so much that it's always going to say yes to whatever it is we're choosing, whatever it is we're thinking, whatever it is we're saying. I think human beings have a habit so often of thinking that we get what we want, when in actual fact we get what we are. And when you start to realize that, then you can start to interact with reality in a much different way. And I feel we've been sold this idea that we need to compromise in relationship when in actual fact it's a bit of a violation of what is truly on to us at all times, which is a completely infinite and an abundant fabric of reality. We can truly have whatever we want. We just need to be clear and intentional in aligning ourselves to that and doing what is required of us, including letting go of what we need to in order to be in alignment to what it is we're wanting and asking for.
So essentially what you're saying is that we enter a relationship or try and make it work from a very identified or very conditioned self, right?
Yeah, I mean, relationship, like anything, is fluid. One of the things I write in my book is we are actually in relationship to all things, not just one other person. You're in relationship to everything that is within your reality. And it's a very beautiful thing when an individual and a person can show up in a way that allows the camera lens to move into focus, to fall in love with another person, to experience more of ourselves through them. However, if another person wasn't consuming your focus in that way, that love is still present. It's just distributed in a more general fashion. There's always a synchronization that's happening. And when you realize that, I just think you start to show up in a bit of a different way. You start to interact with reality in a different way, rather than forcing someone to adhere to your boundaries. You know yourself, know thyself. It's something that is so often disregarded, the power of knowing thyself. When you know who you are, it becomes very easy to make decisions aligned to you without compromise.
I just wanted to kind of elaborate on that, because I think it was also touching around that vulnerability that Nicole is speaking about as well, around boundaries actually are vulnerable, and that's why it requires us to be very courageous in asking for them, because we often see boundaries, if we come from that mindset of the walls or barriers, then it seems to be something that's put in the way of. But if we rather understand that boundaries are that from that place of self-compassion, so that I can love me and love you at the same time, then that is about as vulnerable as I can be with you. Because by putting in that boundary, I'm saying to you, I can now show up more generously and more vulnerably in this relationship. And so I think we've seen boundaries as walls and masks in many ways, where people put up these boundaries, as they term them, but they really are the barriers. It's this kind of, kind of in some spaces, very rigid, very cool, calm, collected stance. For other people, it's this give everything of me, because that means I'm being vulnerable with you. But actually, neither of those are vulnerability. Vulnerability is that when I've put my boundaries in place and I've expressed that, I've made space for you to express yours. Now there's this fullness and aliveness that I'm inviting into our relationship, because we can be so much more compassionate with one another. And compassion is all about present. When we are compassionate people, then I am being present with you, and I'm being present enough with me to be able for us to engage or be in relationship with one another. And I think that sense of knowing self, as Nicole's talking about, in combination, so that awareness of self, in combination with compassion for self and for other, presence, in other words, equals acceptance. And there's ultimately, you then enter into a relationship of acceptance with yourself and with the other. And I feel like that's what makes boundaries actually something really beautiful.
I think Simone and Nicole, you've highlighted something. Nicole, you used the word, you talked about expectations, and Simone, you said acceptance. And for me, the more we accept what is and who is and who I am, the lower the, I don't want to say the lower, the more the less the expectations dictate my boundaries. So to put up a boundary with an expectation of another person's response to that boundary is not acceptance.
It's a neurosis.
Haven't we got them all? Haven't we all got them? So, and again, just this need to be so gentle with ourselves and with everybody else. This is, there's no little magic switch we can flip to go into the state of perfect beingness, because we are human as well as spirit and quantum physics and everything else. And just to acknowledge, I think that acknowledgement of that humanity is what helps us accept and identify with, become who we are and keep becoming who we are. And I think the less our expectations, the more the acceptance, and the more the acceptance, the less our expectation. And that is that, for me, deep vulnerability.
So I think it all starts from the self, right? Acceptance of the self. So there's this question, and that's why I used the word neurosis, but I think we might have answered, we have actually answered. So she says, all the way from Turkey, Nebila, she says, hi everyone, I believe that boundaries in every kind of relationship result from our neurosis. And likewise, our boundaries to our real self also comes from this neurosis. Okay, so I use the term neurosis in the way of Karen Horney. So what do you all think about your relationships and neurosis? I think she's saying neurosis means the deficit between the real self and the imaginary self. And the imaginary self constitutes mainly in childhood and continues to be built over time as we interact with people.
I think with neurosis, it's really important to understand that these are developed as a defense mechanism to protect us. Mm-hmm. And we really want to, draw that distinction between the real self and the false. The real self, coming from the heart, really needs to hold the space of the deepest compassion rather than a resistance against our neuroses, compassion for why and how they've actually been developed, so that those parts of us that are really just trying to get our attention, any part of our personality that is, dominant and, acting in the way that neuroses often do, which can be quite intense, whether that's internal or external, is just needing our attention and our love. And the more we can direct the acceptance and love of who we actually are, our true selves, to those parts of ourselves that have felt unsafe, essentially that's where it has come from. A sense of I'm not safe in the world, therefore I need to create this defense mechanism in order to create safety for myself. The more we can love those aspects of us, the faster they will, calm and return to a place of wholeness. It's really important when you're thinking about neuroses or wounds or kind of, any aspect of us that we don't want to look at, and accept as a part of us. We might think that it's unlovable or ugly. We're never actually separate from our wholeness. This is just an expression, our experiences really, and how can we see that maybe in a more poetic way, as quirks, as aspects of endearment, rather than things that we need to change or fix. How can we embrace them? Because I do believe that although we are an infinite soul and a heart, and we are love and acceptance, we're also a product of our life experiences. And rather than, I think even the language of conditioning can be quite critical, you know. I like to see it in a more artistic way, which is our character. We've developed a character that can be a very beautiful thing. You know, as a writer, I actually find people with the loudest neuroses and the quirkiest works are the most interesting and the most endearing and actually the most lovable.
I think, Nicole, you that touched my heart, because because what I've learned, I mean, I used to be obsessed by this concept of transcending myself, and what I've learned is exactly what you said, Nicole. It's accepting. So all those, as you said as well, whether you call them neuroses or wounds, and we are often told we have to transcend ego and all those sorts of things. And for me, it's about accepting ego as part of my humanity, but noticing when ego's at play, accepting those wounds or those neuroses as part of my humanity and noticing when they're in play. And that, for me, is integration at the deepest, highest level and part of real love.
Simone, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think they've really summed it up well, the sense of what I call the survival suit that we have developed from a very young age to disconnect us, protect us from things that were regarded as shameful or scary or dangerous or threatening. And it's a really sense of honoring that it's there for a reason as well, that survival suit that we've created. And inside, I like the image of Iron Man as a way to describe it, because it is this kind of encasing that we have. But inside Iron Man, there's Tony Stark, and inside each of us, there is the human as well. And our human essence that desperately desires connection and belonging and love. And that's the one that we need to honor. And we need to almost honor the survival suit, the shadow self, or these wounds, the neuroses, and say, you were there for a reason. You were protecting me from something. And when I'm able to acknowledge that, then I'm able to really feel that sense of congruence, that I'm the same on the inside as I am on the outside, and makes us a safer space for us and a more compassionate self for others to be in relationship with.
I really love that share, Simone. I think we need to understand that these parts of us are actually a source of power. You know, the quirks that we develop that make us different and unique. The more we learn to love these things and accept these things, and you know, utilize these things as a part of the deck of cards that we've been given to play in this life, the more powerful we actually become as an individual. When you think about icons in the world, all of them were the quirkiest, the most different, those that could embrace the aspects of their human that, you know, many others would have drowned within insecurity in the face of. There's a power in being able to lean into those edges of who you are that feel unlovable as part of who you are. And that really is bridging the finite with the infinite.
Thank you everyone for watching and being here with us and sharing this 1 hour with us. And so to sum it up, love is possible, or we're able to communicate love, or what we found out from this discussion is there's a difference between communicating and verbalizing. You can communicate energetically versus verbalizing, and boundaries and our needs go hand in hand. And boundaries should come from a place of compassion as well, and it is also dynamic, it changes, and it's very subjective. And also a person has to know oneself and accept oneself's flaws and quirks. And a person who's also had the courage, that's the person who's had the courage, who knows oneself to say no to things that don't serve them. And as Nicole also says, is that self-love is a foundation for everything that we pursue in our life. So thank you everyone for watching, and see you soon.